A freezing, injured grizzly bear stumbles through the thick snowfall, its body weak. Its breathing is heavy with each painful step as it struggles against the relentless winter storm, dragging itself forward with the last ounce of its strength. Desperation drives it toward a flickering light in the distance, a lone cabin standing against the merciless cold. Inside, a woman hears strange noises outside her door. When she opens it, what she finds leaves her speechless. This is a story of survival, compassion, and the unbreakable bond between humans and nature. Before we begin, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and turn on notifications. Your support helps us bring more inspiring stories like this to you. The wind howled outside the small wooden cabin, sending flurries of snow swirling against the frosted windows. Inside, Elena Carter, a woman in her mid-40s, sat by the fire, wrapped in a thick blanket, sipping hot tea. Winters in the Montana wilderness were brutal, but she had long since adapted to the solitude. The quiet was a comfort to her. Then, a sound shattered that silence, a heavy thud against the front porch. Elena froze, her heart pounding. She set her mug down and listened. Another thud. A slow, dragging noise. Something, or someone, was outside. Slowly, she approached the door, grabbing the rifle she kept mounted on the wall. Taking a deep breath, she unlatched the lock and pulled the door open. What she saw made her breath hitch. There, collapsed in the snow, was a massive grizzly bear, its thick fur matted with blood, its body trembling from the cold. Its breath came in ragged gasps, each one a cloud of mist against the frigid air. Elena's instincts screamed at her to shut the door, to retreat inside and wait for the animal to leave. But then she heard it, a soft whimper. Her eyes darted past the bear, scanning the darkness beyond the porch. That's when she saw them. Two tiny grizzly cubs huddled together, their fur soaked from the snow, their small bodies shivering violently. They looked up at her with wide, fearful eyes, their fragile whimpers barely audible over the wind. Elena's breath caught in her throat. The mother bear was injured, possibly dying, and these cubs were completely vulnerable. She hesitated. Letting a wild bear into her cabin was insanity. If it lashed out, it could kill her in an instant. But if she left them out in the cold, they would all surely perish before morning. The bear let out a weak, rumbling groan. It wasn't aggressive. It wasn't moving to attack. It was pleading. Elena had spent years in the wilderness, but never had she been faced with such a dire decision. The snow was relentless, the temperature plummeting further by the minute. She glanced at the cubs again, at their helpless, innocent eyes, and something inside her cracked. She made her choice. With careful, deliberate movements, she stepped aside and opened the door wider. The bear barely managed to lift its head, its dark eyes locking onto hers. Trust. That's what she saw in them. Come on, she whispered. Before it's too late. The mother bear, as if understanding, let out another weak groan and pushed herself forward, dragging her heavy body across the threshold. The cubs hesitated for only a moment before following, their tiny paws sinking into the wooden floor, leaving behind small trails of melted snow. Elena shut the door behind them, sealing out the bitter cold. And just like that, she had let 3 wild grizzlies into her home. The warmth of the cabin hit the bears instantly, a stark contrast to the merciless cold they had fought to survive. Steam rose from the mother bear's fur as the icy water clinging to it began to melt. The cubs huddled close to her, their tiny bodies still trembling, their wide eyes darting between their mother and the strange human standing before them. Elena backed away cautiously, her grip tightening around the rifle she had instinctively grabbed before opening the door. She knew grizzlies. She had seen them in the wild countless times, watched them from a safe distance. But never had she been this close. This vulnerable. The mother bear groaned, shifting slightly on the wooden floor, her massive body barely able to support its own weight. Blood matted the fur along her left side, and Elena could now see the deep gash along her shoulder, likely from another animal. The wound was fresh, oozing slightly, and the bear's breathing was ragged. She was in pain. Elena hesitated, her heart pounding. What was she supposed to do? If the bear died here, the cubs wouldn't stand a chance. But if she tried to help and the bear panicked, it could be fatal for both of them. Slowly, she lowered the rifle and took a deep breath. Easy now, she murmured, more to herself than to the bears. Her instincts screamed at her to keep her distance, but she couldn't ignore the desperation in those dark eyes. She moved carefully, grabbing an old, thick blanket from a chair and draping it over the mother bear's back. The animal let out a deep, guttural sound, something between a growl and a sigh, but didn't move away. The cubs whimpered at the sudden movement, pressing closer to their mother's side. Elena took another breath, thinking fast. She had supplies, basic first aid, antiseptic. But treating a grizzly bear? That was something else entirely. Still, she couldn't turn them away now. She had made her choice the moment she opened the door. Moving cautiously, she grabbed a bowl and filled it with warm water, placing it a few feet away from the bear. The mother sniffed the air, her body trembling as she lifted her head slightly. She was exhausted, barely holding on. Elena knew she had a long night ahead of her. The hours dragged on, and the cabin was filled with the soft crackling of the fire, the occasional gust of wind rattling the windows, and the slow, labored breathing of the injured mother bear. Elena sat at her small wooden table, her eyes flicking between the sleeping cubs nestled against their mother and the wound on the bear's shoulder, which still oozed sluggishly. She knew enough about animal injuries to recognize infection when she saw it. If she didn't do something soon, the bear wouldn't last the night. Elena stood, moving carefully across the room, trying not to startle the wild creatures in her home. She rummaged through a small first aid kit tucked in the kitchen cabinet, antiseptic, gauze, some old rags. Not much, but enough to at least clean the wound. Her hands trembled as she approached the bear. "I don't know if you understand me," she whispered, kneeling beside the massive creature, "but I need to help you." The mother bear lifted her head slightly, her dark eyes meeting Elena's. The woman swallowed hard, waiting for any sign of aggression, but none came. The bear was too weak to fight, too exhausted to resist. Elena exhaled, dipping the rag into warm water and wringing it out. Slowly, carefully, she reached out and began cleaning the wound. The bear flinched but didn't growl. The cubs stirred, letting out soft, questioning sounds, but they didn't move from their mother's side. The cut was deep, probably from another bear. The edges were ragged, dried blood crusting around them. Elena worked as gently as she could, dabbing antiseptic along the wound, whispering soothing words she wasn't sure the bear could even understand. Still, the mother barely reacted beyond the occasional flick of her ears or twitch of her muscles. Minutes stretched into what felt like hours, and finally, Elena wrapped the wound as best she could with gauze and cloth. It wasn't much, but it was something. Exhausted, she sat back against the cabin wall, letting out a slow breath. The weight of the situation was finally settling in. She had a wounded, full-grown grizzly and 2 cubs in her home, and she had no idea what would happen when morning came. Her stomach growled. The adrenaline had kept her going, but now the hunger gnawed at her insides. She glanced toward the cupboards. There was enough food for her, but what about the bears? She stood and rummaged through her supplies, pulling out what little meat she had stored. She didn't eat much meat herself, but she always kept some on hand for emergencies. This certainly qualified as one. She placed a plate of raw venison near the bear, stepping back cautiously. The mother lifted her nose, sniffing weakly. After a long pause, she barely nudged the meat with her nose before resting her head back on the floor. She was too weak to eat. The cubs, however, perked up. They cautiously moved toward the plate, sniffing at the offering. After a few hesitant moments, one of them, the slightly bigger one, took the first bite. The second followed shortly after. Elena let out a relieved sigh. At least they were eating. The night stretched on. Elena kept the fire burning, watching over her unlikely guests with a mixture of awe and anxiety. She didn't know what the morning would bring, but one thing was certain. Their fight for survival wasn't over yet. Morning arrived in a haze of golden light filtering through the cabin windows. The fire had died down to embers, and the cold crept in through the wooden walls. Elena shifted in her chair, stiff from exhaustion. Her eyes flickered to the mother bear, whose breathing had become steadier, though she remained motionless. The cubs were curled against her side, their tiny bodies rising and falling with each breath. The weight of the previous night's decision still sat heavily on Elena's shoulders. She had taken in wild bears. The sheer madness of it was only now beginning to settle in. But there was no turning back. The mother bear was in no condition to leave, and the cubs depended on her survival. Elena carefully stood, stretching her aching muscles before moving toward the fireplace. She stoked the embers back to life, adding fresh logs until warmth returned to the small space. The bears didn't stir. It was a fragile peace, but peace nonetheless. She approached the mother bear again, crouching beside her. The wound she had cleaned the night before was still raw, but at least it wasn't actively bleeding. However, the infection was a real threat. Elena needed to find something stronger to treat it. She rummaged through her supplies, searching for anything that might help. Antibiotics were out of the question, she had none. But she did have an old remedy. Honey. Grabbing a small jar, she hesitated before kneeling beside the bear once more. "All right, big girl," she murmured, dipping her fingers into the golden liquid. "Let's see if this helps." As gently as she could, she spread a thin layer of honey over the wound, watching for any reaction. The bear's ears twitched, but she didn't move. The cubs stirred slightly but remained tucked against their mother. A flicker of hope sparked in Elena's chest. If she could keep the wound clean and prevent infection, the bear might actually recover. Stepping back, she sighed. "Well, you're stuck with me now." Over the next few days, Elena tended to the bear as best she could. She kept the wound clean, fed the cubs small portions of meat, and made sure the cabin remained warm. The mother bear began to show small signs of improvement. She lifted her head more often, her breathing grew stronger, and one afternoon, she even lapped up some water from a bowl Elena had placed nearby. But trust was still a fragile thing. The cubs, though playful and curious, kept their distance. The mother bear, despite her weakness, watched Elena carefully, never fully letting her guard down. Elena respected that. This was still a wild animal, despite their strange circumstances. One night, as she sat by the fire, she felt eyes watching her. Glancing over, she met the deep gaze of the mother bear. Unlike before, there was no fear in them. No panic. Just understanding. Elena exhaled. "We're going to figure this out, aren't we?" she whispered. The bear didn't respond, of course. But something in her gaze told Elena that maybe, just maybe, she wasn't alone in this anymore. The days passed in a fragile routine. Elena fed the cubs small portions of meat and fish, replenished the water for the mother bear, and cleaned the wound twice a day. Each movement was cautious, measured. She never forgot that she was tending to a wild predator, even if the circumstances were unusual. The cubs grew more curious about her, inching closer when she moved about the cabin. The mother, however, remained guarded. Though she no longer growled when Elena approached, her watchful eyes followed every movement. One evening, as Elena sat by the fire, she noticed something remarkable. The mother bear, who had been struggling to move for days, slowly stretched her limbs and lifted herself upright. It wasn't graceful, she winced, her wounded shoulder clearly causing discomfort, but she was regaining her strength. The cubs immediately pressed against her, nuzzling into her fur as if reassuring themselves that their mother was truly recovering. A smile tugged at the corners of Elena's lips. She's going to make it. That night, Elena was awakened by the sound of howling winds outside. She sat up in bed, pulling her blanket tightly around her shoulders as she listened to the storm rage against the cabin walls. The snowstorm had returned, fiercer than before. She got up and checked the small supply of firewood stacked by the stove. It would last a couple of days, but if the storm continued longer, she'd have to brave the cold to gather more. The thought made her stomach tighten. She could handle herself in the wilderness, but leaving the bears alone inside her cabin, that was another matter entirely. Glancing over, she saw the mother bear awake as well, her ears twitching at the sound of the wind. The cubs were nestled between her paws, fast asleep. Their safety depended on this shelter, on Elena's choice to let them in. She took a deep breath and whispered into the dim cabin, "We're in this together now." The next morning, the storm had weakened, but the snowfall was thick, burying the porch in a blanket of white. Elena pulled on her heavy coat and boots, grabbing an axe before stepping outside. The cold bit at her exposed skin as she trudged through the snow to gather firewood from the small shed near the tree line. As she worked, something felt off. The usual stillness of the wilderness had been replaced by an unsettling silence, no birds, no distant sounds of wildlife, only the wind whistling through the trees. Then she saw them. Tracks large, deep impressions in the snow leading toward the edge of the clearing. And they weren't from the bear in her cabin. These tracks were fresh. Another predator was nearby. Elena's pulse quickened. A mountain lion? Another bear? The possibility sent a shiver down her spine. She gripped the axe tightly and backed toward the cabin, keeping her eyes on the tree line. Nothing moved, but she could feel something watching her. When she reached the door, she shut it quickly, bolting it behind her. The mother bear lifted her head, her ears twitching. She smelled it too. They weren't alone. Elena's mind raced. She had been so focused on nursing this bear back to health that she hadn't considered the dangers her presence might attract. If another predator decided to stake a claim near the cabin, they were all in danger. The cubs whimpered, sensing the tension in their mother. Elena sat near the fire, gripping the axe, her heart pounding. They had survived this long, but their biggest challenge was yet to come. The cabin had never felt so small. The storm raged outside, battering the wooden walls with relentless gusts of wind. The snowfall was thick, nearly blinding, creating a world of white that swallowed all sound except the howling blizzard. Inside, the fire crackled softly, casting dancing shadows on the walls, but the warmth did little to ease the tension that now filled the room. Elena sat near the door, gripping the handle of the axe she had retrieved after seeing the tracks near the tree line. The presence of another predator loomed over her like a specter. She didn't know what it was, but she had felt it watching. The mother bear sensed it too. Though she was still recovering, her posture had changed. She was alert, ears twitching at every sound beyond the cabin walls. The cubs, oblivious to the tension, slept soundly against their mother's warm body. Then it happened. A low, guttural growl carried through the storm. Elena's breath hitched. It was close. The mother bear let out a deep, warning rumble in response. She wasn't strong enough for a fight, but her instinct to protect her young was unwavering. Her massive frame shifted slightly, positioning herself between the cubs and the door. Elena tightened her grip on the axe. The wind howled louder, rattling the cabin, but she could still hear footsteps crunching in the snow. Slow. Deliberate. Circling. A shadow passed by the window. Elena's pulse thundered in her ears. Was it another bear? A mountain lion? Wolves? Her mind raced through the possibilities. If it was another grizzly, the cabin walls wouldn't be enough to keep it out. If it was wolves, they wouldn't dare take on an adult bear, but the cubs? The thought made her stomach twist. They were vulnerable. Then came the sound that sent chills down her spine, a low, snarling breath right outside the door. Elena swallowed hard, forcing herself to think. She couldn't afford to panic. Whatever was out there was testing them, waiting for an opportunity. If she made the wrong move, it could turn into a fight for survival. For what felt like an eternity, the predator outside waited. Elena remained frozen near the door, every muscle coiled like a spring. The mother bear was tense, her powerful body shifting slightly, her breath steady but ready. Then, without warning, a heavy thud hit the side of the cabin. The impact sent a jolt through Elena's spine. The cubs woke, letting out high-pitched cries of fear. The mother bear responded immediately, rising to her full height despite her injuries. She let out a deep, resonant roar, not one of aggression, but of warning. Silence followed. The air was thick with anticipation. Would it attack? Would it leave? Elena held her breath. She could hear sniffing near the door, followed by the sound of paws crunching in the snow as the creature moved. It circled the cabin once more, then nothing. Minutes passed. The only sound was the wind. Elena's grip on the axe slowly relaxed, her arms aching from tension. The mother bear lowered herself back to the ground, breathing heavily. The cubs, though frightened, settled back against her warmth. The threat had passed, for now. Elena exhaled sharply, running a trembling hand over her face. They had made it through the night, but whatever was out there wasn't gone. It was watching, waiting, and it would be back. Morning arrived, but the sense of unease lingered like a shadow over the cabin. The predator that had circled them in the night had left no fresh tracks in the snow, but Elena knew better than to think it was gone for good. It was waiting, watching. The mother bear stirred, her massive frame shifting as she struggled to stand. Her wound, though healing, still limited her strength. She stretched her limbs cautiously, her keen eyes scanning the cabin before settling on Elena. There was no more hesitation in that gaze, only a quiet understanding. They were in this together now. Elena took a deep breath and stepped outside, gripping the axe tightly. The cold bit at her skin as she surveyed the tree line. The snow glistened under the weak morning sun, untouched except for the faint trails left by small woodland creatures. There was no immediate danger, but the silence was unnatural. As she gathered firewood, her mind raced. How long could she keep them here? The mother bear was getting stronger, but she was still vulnerable. The cubs, though growing quickly, were not yet ready to survive on their own. And with a new predator stalking them, every decision felt like it could mean life or death. She returned to the cabin and met the mother bear's gaze. "You can't stay here forever," she murmured, "but I won't let anything happen to you." The bear blinked slowly, almost as if she understood. That night, the tension returned. The wind had settled, but an eerie silence had taken its place. Elena lay awake, staring at the ceiling, listening, waiting. Then she heard it. A sharp crack outside. Something heavy stepping on a frozen branch. She bolted upright. The mother bear growled lowly, her ears pricked, her body tense. The cubs whimpered, pressing against her side. Elena moved to the door, gripping the axe tightly. Through the small window, she saw it, a pair of yellow eyes gleaming in the darkness. It wasn't another bear. It was a mountain lion. Her breath caught. A mountain lion this close to a cabin, to a full-grown grizzly, was not normal behavior. It was desperate. The lion took another step forward, muscles coiling as it prepared to strike. Elena didn't have time to think, only to act. She grabbed a flaming log from the fireplace and threw open the door. With a shout, she waved the fire in front of her, the heat and light casting a bright glow against the snow. The mountain lion snarled but hesitated. The mother bear, now on her feet despite her injury, let out a deep, thunderous roar that shook the very air. It was a challenge, a declaration of power. For a tense moment, the lion and bear locked eyes. Then, with a final snarl, the predator turned and vanished into the trees. Elena stood frozen, heart hammering in her chest. The mother bear huffed and turned to look at her. And for the first time, Elena knew she was ready. The next morning, the mother bear stood by the cabin door. She looked stronger, her eyes clearer, her stance more sure. The cubs played in the snow nearby, oblivious to the weight of the moment. Elena opened the door, stepping aside. The bear paused, her dark eyes locking onto Elena's one last time. And then, without hesitation, she lumbered forward, stepping into the wild where she belonged. The cubs followed, bounding through the snow, their tiny bodies full of life. Elena watched them disappear into the trees, her chest tight with emotions she couldn't quite name. She had saved them. And they had saved her. The cabin felt emptier now, but not lonely, because deep in the heart of the wilderness, she knew they would always remember. If this story touched your heart, make sure to subscribe to the channel, like this video, and share it with someone who loves inspiring stories. Help us spread messages of courage and hope to more people around the world.